Donald Trump is furious again. And this time, the fight is over something that sounds pretty simple: crime statistics. But once you actually look at what happened, this story gets a lot more interesting. A new report from the Center for American Progress is challenging one of the Trump administration's biggest arguments about Washington, D.C. The argument is this: Trump says his administration stepped in, deployed the National Guard, put federal forces on the streets, and helped make Washington safer. But researchers at the Center for American Progress are saying, hold on. The crime numbers were already moving in that direction before the National Guard deployment began. And if that's true, then the big question becomes, did the deployment actually cause crime to fall, or was crime already falling anyway? That's the part that has Donald Trump extremely angry. Here's what happened. Chandler Hall, an associate director for public safety at the Center for American Progress, appeared on C-SPAN to talk about the organization's new analysis. Hall discussed crime trends in Washington and other cities where the Trump administration deployed National Guard troops. And the basic argument from the report is pretty straightforward. You can't simply look at a city where crime went down after troops arrived and automatically conclude that the troops caused the decline. You have to look at what was happening before the deployment. And according to the analysis, Washington's crime rate was already trending downward. That trend didn't suddenly change direction when the National Guard arrived. It continued along roughly the same trajectory. And that matters. Because there's a huge difference between saying crime went down while the National Guard was deployed and saying crime went down because of the National Guard. Those are two completely different claims. And that's where this political fight really begins. Trump has repeatedly pointed to Washington's falling crime numbers as evidence that his policies are working. But critics say the president is taking credit for a trend that was already happening. And now Trump has responded in the way we've seen him respond many times before. He went after the people behind the report. Trump attacked Chandler Hall personally, mocked the Center for American Progress, and questioned the organization's funding and credibility. He also suggested that a lawsuit could be coming. And this is where things get interesting from a legal standpoint, because the Center for American Progress isn't secretly leaking some private document. They're analyzing government. They're looking at crime statistics and making an argument about what those numbers mean. You can disagree with their conclusion. You can argue that their methodology is wrong. You can publish another study and reach a completely different conclusion. That's part of political debate. But simply criticizing a government policy isn't automatically defamation. And that's an important distinction. Now, there's another side to this story. Not every researcher agrees that the National Guard deployment had absolutely no impact. Other analysis has suggested that a visible presence of National Guard troops and federal personnel may have helped reduce certain types of opportunistic crime. So let's be clear here. The argument isn't necessarily that having National Guard troops on the streets literally changed nothing. The bigger question is whether the deployment produced the dramatic improvement that Trump claims. And that's where the evidence becomes much harder to interpret, because crime doesn't move for just one reason. Police departments change their strategies. People change their behavior. Economic conditions change. Different types of crime rise and fall at different times. And sometimes a crime trend is already moving in one direction before politicians even announce a new policy. That's why researchers compare what was happening before and after an intervention. And according to the Center for American Progress Analysis, that's exactly the problem with Trump's argument. The decline was already underway. So if the government is going to spend enormous amounts of money on a deployment, you need to be able to show what additional benefit that spending produced. And we're talking about serious money here. The cost of keeping the Washington National Guard deployment going through January 2029 has been estimated at roughly $1.4 billion. That's taxpayer money. So imagine you're a taxpayer watching all of this. You hear the president saying, crime is down, Washington is safer. Then you hear researchers saying, yes, crime is down, but it was already going down before this deployment. Now you're left with a very simple question. What exactly did the billion-dollar deployment accomplish? And that's a question that shouldn't belong exclusively to Democrats or Republicans. It should be asked by everybody. If the deployment worked, show us the numbers. If it didn't, explain why it should continue. And if crime was already falling before the deployment, explain why the administration should receive all the credit.